All right, welcome to our next interview with a very special guest, Alaina Roberts. She is at, oh gosh,
The University of
Pittsburgh, right?
Pittsburgh.
University of Pittsburgh, you are. The one thing I didn't write down, embarrassing here. All right, let's do that again. All right, welcome to another interview, and today we feature Alaina Roberts. She is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. She got her PhD at Indiana University in 2017, and she is an award-winning historian. She, for example, got a postdoc at the Richards Center and awards from the Western History Association. She has published a few articles in Civil War history and the Western Historical Quarterly, and also popular pieces in the Washington Post, for example. And we are going to talk today about her newest book, which I think I will put somewhere in the screen. I have been here all the while, Black Freedom on Native Land. A really interesting book as I was reading through it. As I said on Twitter to somebody, I wished it would have been like 100 pages longer at times, but I do understand that it's not necessarily your decision. But I was curious, how did you come to be interested in the Indian Territory and looking not at the native population, but African Americans?
Well, this is my father's family story. And I started really kind of on the genealogical side, wanting to know more about that, searching for identity, those kinds of cliches. And then I realized that in the academic world, that story had not been kind of told as much. And so there had been work on predominantly the Cherokees at that point. Um, there is, I'd argue, still the most work has been done on the Cherokees. Increasingly, people are moving into the Choctaws and Chickasaws, like Nakia Parker. I think Faye Yarborough is moving there as well. But I really wanted to kind of be able to tell that story about my family and kind of help the broader world as well as the academic world understand what this kind of different Black experience was like.
And speaking, just kind of get into the book a little bit, what are you actually arguing in the book? What is kind of the big point of it?
Well, there are two interlocking arguments. So the first one really centers on my family and other Black and mixed race people who live in Native nations, what their life was like as slaves a little bit, but really how they experienced freedom and what that meant to them. And often that meant to them land ownership and holding on to that land. For my family specifically, it meant not having rights, but still wanting to live on that land. And for other freedmen, it meant having rights and land and opportunities that African Americans in the South did not have. So, really, this kind of different Reconstruction story that looks at federal intervention in the West, in Indian Territory, that has a different outcome than Reconstruction in the South. The second argument is about land settlement in Indian Territory, and it looks at basically different waves of settlers and makes an argument that Native people can be settlers when they move into a different space and when they use language that really positions them as more civilized and is better than other Native people and is better than people of African descent. And then their former slaves who were Black and mixed race, African Americans from the South, also use these kind of similar arguments to try to claim this land and this opportunity for themselves.
And I think that's the one of the most fascinating aspects that you have in the book, because it seems like we're having like not just these two argumentative interlocking stories, but also that you're treating on some level the Indian Territory as Native Americans colonizing the land. So it's sort of an imperial narrative that we have. But then at the same time, there's the African American story here as well. And very often in recent works, I've seen that we're trying to treat the Indian Territory as sort of a borderland or a border state. And that sort of implies that we're already having sort of a settled environment, right?
Right. So I use a term that I believe I've coined. Perhaps someone has coined it before me, but I call it the settler colonial process. which is the way that non-white peoples kind of take on beliefs of Europeans and Americans about what makes a person civilized. And so the idea for Indian Territory is that you don't have those kinds of concepts. You don't have slavery that is practiced in the Euro American way until these native people come to this space and really change it. And so they are really the first wave of people who kind of believe in that way. And so it's not just kind of the white American government or white American settlers who come in and then bring this later on when Oklahoma becomes a state. I'm arguing that it happens earlier through people who are not white but do have beliefs, some of which mirror kind of the American settler state.
And it sort of raises an interesting point, I think, of how many, just kind of in general terms, how many people are actually aware, you think, that when the Cherokee are being removed from the Choctaw and other tribes to the Indian territories, that there's actually slavery that they bring with them into that region, and that I think you have the number like around 20% of the population is enslaved at the time of the Civil War in the territory. It, is that, I mean, I hope in Oklahoma it's somewhat known, but it doesn't seem like this is necessarily something we know about well.
For Oklahoma, it's actually surprisingly still not well known, even among like Native people who are like Cherokee or Chickasaw. They don't know their own history often, for kind of various reasons. I mean, it's a history that people are not proud of, and it's been hidden in some ways. But the broader world, I feel like, has kind of instances where they become aware of this and then it's forgotten because it is really not kind of made part of our narrative. Like it's still, oh, black people lived in the South and they were mostly slaves on plantations, and that's kind of what we get in school and like even often what we get in college. And I think it takes a while to get through to the population and really change this idea that black people only lived in one place and only had one experience.
And that, on the other hand, I think you mentioned in the book that it is very different of how African Americans are treated by these tribes. That in some cases, freedom sort of grants them a right to stay, and in other cases, they're kind of treated as second-class citizens still, even after freedom.
Yeah, so it's a complicated narrative where you still certainly have racism and prejudice present, but because there is not kind of the settler state present and there's not the kind of mass white supremacy that is in the South and parts of the North, there are still kind of opportunities for black people to have the kinds of rights that African Americans don't have in the South. And so, particularly, the ability to serve on juries, the ability to vote in tribal elections and to become tribal leaders, like, for instance, serving on tribal councils, is something that was done like until Oklahoma statehood in most of these nations. Not the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, but the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Seminoles. They all have tribal leaders who are black. And I really kind of argue that it's the change in jurisdiction brought by Oklahoma Territory and then the state of Oklahoma that kind of drastically and irrevocably changes this.
And it's interesting because we do see some kind of I was struck. It's sort of like there in the South. There's always this kind of, yeah. We know it's white supremacy, but how would we talk about like there being in some of these tribes this kind of looking down on African Americans? I mean, you have kind of a notion of like, I mean, we can't call it white supremacy, right?
No, I suppose not. I guess it's like how we think of racism, and there are multiple schools of thought. I mean, I know. I guess one is Ibram Kendi's is like anyone can be racist.
Hmm.
I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that because the institutions in these tribal governments are not the same, and they until really the late 1800s, they still allow for certain degrees of adoption of black and mixed race people and of kind of ways of incorporating them into their tribe and into their culture that is not present in kind of white societies. So it's such a different context, and yet the way you see racism deployed is often very similar, especially for people who are like large scale plantation owners and have really kind of taken on the trappings of Euro American culture. But that is not every Native person. Like there are plenty of Native people who don't believe in acculturation, believe that anti-blackness, believe that slavery is becoming too much like the white man, and so they fight back against that.
It, you mentioned slave plantations, and that's sort of, I mean, I have the image of like, okay, in Alabama, I can picture a slave plantation. In Louisiana, I can. What do I have to think of in Oklahoma or in the Native American territory when you say plantation? Is it the same kind of look like master's house, slave quarters, cotton fields, or is there some uniqueness that Native Americans bring to that idea? Sorry.
There is a spectrum that is similar to the South. So you certainly have large scale plantation owners who like lived in Georgia or Mississippi and basically transported those plantations to Indian territory. So you have the big house, you have slave quarters, but then there are also like smaller scale slaveholders who only have like one enslaved person who lives with them. And the treatment can also vary, but there are former slaves who talk about their owner, like, you know, slept on the floor with them, worked in the fields with them, ate at the same table as them. So it's a similar to diversity kind of experiences.
And I mean, one of the concepts you have in the book is the settler colonialism and the notion of civilization that the tribes bring. And I mean, it really sounds like the Indian Territory is just sort of a carbon copy on some level of a southern state. And in part, I'm kind of wondering how much do tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw Creek, how much do they see themselves as that civilized tribe and slavery being part of being civilized? And they are still Native American, but then how's that relationship between them and say Comanche or Cheyenne, which are their neighbors on the western side?
I feel like that's where you are really able to tease out the identity, at least for the kinds of tribal leaders who are leaving records. For the everyday kind of native person, we don't have those as much, but generally it does seem like they really do see themselves as different. And so they see slaveholding, they see their involvement in agriculture, their involvement in capitalism as something that does differentiate them in important ways, especially when these Western tribes are raiding them and taking those things because they don't kind of want to work for them themselves. But there also, I think, is an important facet of Native identity that all of them keep, even people who like might look on the outside like a white American, like for instance, like mixed race people, like many of the Chickasaw and Choctaw leaders were. They are still like very proud Native men who defer to often their mother's cultures. So it's kind of like a weird mixture. Like yes, in many ways it is like a southern state, but the kind of tribal sovereignty aspect and tribal identity, I think, is still very important.
Again, I find this just fascinating because it's an area I'm not that familiar with personally. But let's get to, because you mentioned that really the big story here is about freedom and kind of the reconstruction process. And now one of the things that I kind of wondered about is, so we have at the end of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, which ends slavery in territories in rebellion. So, but that doesn't apply to the Indian Territory, right?
Right.
So we have the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery in the country. But if I understood it correctly, that doesn't apply here either, because it is in the treaties that the US makes after the war with the tribes that slavery really comes to a close with the tribes.
Yes, so the five tribes are involved in the Civil War in various ways, fighting on the sides of the Union and the Confederacy, trying to stay neutral, some of them becoming refugees in order to avoid the conflict. And it is this kind of interesting thing where they're obviously part of this war, but they are still separate foreign entities. So, yes, even though the Emancipation Proclamation would perhaps kind of technically apply because they are areas in rebellion, they're not the United States, so it doesn't. The 13th Amendment also does not. And so, because they are foreign nations, treaties have to be made to make significant changes. And in these treaties, the US is still overstepping its bounds because it is not supposed to have the right or the jurisdiction to change things like citizenship or land allotment, since they have just around 30 years earlier like promised that we are not going to touch the land that we forced you to move on to. But yeah, the kind of treaty process is what makes this reconstruction interesting because it is forced onto them in a kind of a similar way as some things are forced onto Southerners, but it's more retributive than the South, and it also almost has more staying power than a lot of the kind of changes that are made in the South.
And that sort of raises two other questions that I was wondering about, because in parts this sort of indicates to us um, the importance that native sovereignty still has. That native tribes are, as you say, foreign entities, so we can't, even though they live on U.S. soil, they are separate. So that said, though, we do have these decisions where Georgia ignores the Supreme Court decision with regard to it. So it's this really contested space, right? When it comes to native sovereignty, we're respected when we want to, and we ignore it when we want to.
Right.
And then the other point, and this sort of goes in the direction of kind of how do we look at the West, right? It's like, is the Indian Territory part of what you kind of indicates a Southern experience, or in the sort of where I want to see what your reaction is, should we think of it also as a Western experience here, what the native tribes are going through? Because we have to go and make a treaty with the tribes um, to to end slavery in the same fashion that it's sort of an afterthought of like, oh, there's peonage in New Mexico, and that isn't included in the 13th Amendment.
I think emancipation in Indian Territory is almost more similar in some ways to like Galveston, Texas, where there are still people, white people, holding Black Americans in bondage even after they're kind of ordered not to. And so the U.S. government comes into Indian Territory bringing a number of militia to like forcibly do this because they are getting word from some African Americans who have like left Indian Territory that this is still going on. We need your help. And the treaty is made, but it's already kind of assumed that this is what is going to happen. So the Cherokees, for example, have already emancipated their slaves in 1863, around the same time as the Emancipation Proclamation. So I see it as kind of the hmm, still the same as slavery, and it's just it really continues longer because some slaveholders refuse to free their slaves versus kind of a debt peonage, which is another labor system that is not kind of really um, discussed or like is almost portently ignored in things like the 13th Amendment.
Sure. Um, and that's sort of, I think, the importance of kind of trying to figure out where are the separations of Western and Civil War histories that we kind of need to kind of tease out more over the next years in kind of scholarship to kind of delineate where is the Civil War in the West, right? Uh, but in kind of that whole like issue of like sovereignty, 13th Amendment, I think that the other part that struck me was when we get into the Reconstruction Amendments and African Americans get the right to vote finally. that does apply to Africans in the Indian Territory.
It doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's sort of this weird gray area, right? It's like the native population can't vote, so African Americans in the Indian Territory are also considered native, right? Where would they fit in this identity of the 15th Amendment?
Well, they're considered, yes, tribal citizens. So they win the right to vote in the treaties of 1866, along with, they're supposed to have all the rights that every tribal citizen has, every Indian citizen. But I've talked to this with people about this with people like Dave Pryor, and I just kind of asked, like, if these people were to go into the United States, would they then have all of those rights, kind of that the amendments are granting to African Americans? And he said he thinks so because they would not necessarily be you could not tell a freedman from an African American. Like they would both look black to someone, and they don't have the kind of bureaucratic systems like birth certificates.
Mhm.
Those are coming later. So if they go into the United States, they have those rights. But in Indian Territory, I think in many ways they're classified as Native people, and Native Americans. I mean, as you said, they don't get the right to vote until 1924. Generally, um, in various spaces like New England, and they've gotten it kind of over time with Indian Territory. They gain the right to vote basically with the Dawes Act. So as they get land allotments and are kind of made American citizens through that process.
And I was actually going to write, as you said, Dawes Act. I was actually going to go with that as kind of land redistribution and kind of so under the Dawes Act, we have the kind of attempt to turn Native Americans into civilized Americans. Everyone has individual land ownership, which goes against tribal ownership, obviously. Um, it seems like a violation of the sovereignty that Native Americans have. Um, and then the other point, and I'll let you go with that in a minute. The other point is, it seems like again we're going into this gray area, right? Of like, are African Americans who were slaves in these native tribes now tribal members and thus covered under the Dawes Act, or are they just are they African Americans and thus not covered under the Dawes Act?
Under the Dawes Act, they are treated as tribal citizens, and the Dawes Commission, I argue, is often the agent who is kind of arguing for their rights that are outlined in the treaties of 1866. So when tribes themselves, like representatives of the Chickasaws or the Cherokees, try to kind of take mass freedmen off of their rolls, or try to say like that person was not a former slave here, they don't get land. It's the Dawes Commission that follows up on these accusations and actually tries to help freed people often. Or when the tribes try to say someone is not Indian, and sometimes the Dawes Commission will intervene if the black or mixed race person can prove that they have that ancestry in various problematic ways. But yes, they are considered tribal citizens, and the federal government is helpful to them in ways that it is not helpful to Native people.
Mm. But on some level, when you were talking there about the Dawes Commission and helping African Americans and kind of land with regard to land question, it almost sounded a little bit like what the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to do in the South, right?
Yeah, they're kind of interesting parallel institutions. They are kind of providing really since before no since with the end of the war, freedmen can write to the secretary of the interior, who kind of is advising the Dawes Commission on certain issues, can write to various officials, and then later on when the Dawes Commission is created they write to them, and they are always kind of looking to them to secure their rights, and to advocate for them. And this of course is in many ways an intervention of tribal sovereignty again, because the whole issue is trying to take as much land from native people and native tribes as possible, and yet it's helping black people who are trying to advocate for themselves.
In part, it sort of raises, I mean, it raises a lot of interesting questions again, but I think in part it sort of raises, I think, this a bit of a counterfactual, I suppose, of here you have the Dawes Commission and the US government trying to help African Americans obtain land in the Indian Territory, something that the US government fails to do in the South. So, and we're going to go back later on with regards to the racial question, I think, with regard to Oklahoma, but here it almost sounds a little bit like, is this something we should or could look at as sort of how Reconstruction could have been and could have been somewhat more successful to help African Americans?
Yes, that's why I'm always kind of confused as to why more people don't know about this or why historians don't kind of find this fascinating. Because yes, it is American governmental force used to help black people,
Mhm.
and the only kind of downside is that yes, it is with a very specific purpose, and that is to move in white settlers. But at the same time, it's really kind of a small number of Republicans who are able to kind of push through their agenda for black rights and land ownership in Indian territory because they're not going to get the pushback from Democrats or from white Southerners that they would if they tried to do that in the United States.
And, and the other part too is that um, so you have African Americans now as landowners, and you nicely show like how they're creating these own communities and kind of create their own little entities. And I interviewed, gosh, I think we published it last 2 weeks, say Page's book on colonization, and there was also kind of conversations about colonization into the American West. Um, so in part, it obviously these are individuals who lived in Oklahoma or in the Indian Territory who are creating these communities, and you also have African Americans from the South moving into the Indian Territory, right?
Mhm.
So are they, how are they getting along with each other? And also, is this sort of, how much are people maybe looking at these African American communities as sort of maybe an escape from from discrimination in the South?
Yes, Indian Territory is seen by many as a racial paradise, as a possibility. And just like we said 5 minutes ago, it is like they very much see the kind of parallel that what didn't happen for them in the South is happening in Indian Territory. And they want that for themselves. And so there is kind of a mass newspaper editorial campaign where editors like kind of talk about the kind of per capita payments, money that freedmen are getting, the land that they're getting. There are speculators and people who come to various southern communities trying to draw African Americans to Indian Territory and then later Oklahoma Territory. So it's very much a place of hope, and often that is realized. I mean, Black Wall Street is an example of a place that was a black native space that became an African American haven. Sometimes it didn't, but the people who talk about kind of the how maybe they didn't like get rich like they had hoped, they still say it's better than the South.
Mhm.
Um, and going to your question about the relationships between these two groups of black people, there's a lot of intermarriage.
Mhm.
So, certainly there was kind of a common understanding of one another. At the same time, there were other people who looked at these other black people as encroachers.
Mhm.
Um, because when you have these black people migrating in mass to this space, some native people get afraid. So some tribal governments are afraid that they're going to be overwhelmed by these black people. You have racist legislators who see kind of black presence in native nations as something that kind of muddies the waters and like, oh, are these people Indian anymore if they have so many native people who are like intermarrying with black people? And so it's a question of survival for native tribes, but it's also A question of racism. I mean, because they don't kind of have the same arguments for white settlers until later when they become really scared.
Mm. Well, it seems like too that bringing kind of the white story and Oklahoma Territory in a little bit, that by the time Oklahoma Territory comes into existence, we almost have like a clash of three different attempts of civilization, right? We have the native attempt, we have the African attempt, and then we have the white attempt of how do you civilize this territory, quote unquote.
Yes, and Oklahoma Territory is really like that's where you see the start of kind of discriminatory legislation that then becomes part of Oklahoma's estate later on. Whereas in Indian Territory, you, for the most part, don't have that.
Mhm.
So, yes, it is kind of two different cultures coming together, and some of those become part of Oklahoma, but for the most part, the state really is kind of the realization of white settler dreams, not any of these kind of other settler groups who had hoped to make this space their home.
And go with Oklahoma then. How does that state, like, I mean, we have that native vision, we have the African American dreams here. How does this state go so off the track that it turns into something that is akin to like deep South Mississippi or Alabama when it comes to race relations, discrimination, I mean, lynchings that you mention in the book?
I think that kind of goes back to the question of is Indian Territory, is Oklahoma the South or the West?
Hmm.
You have a lot of Southerners moving there who take their values and their legislation with them. But then, of course, the Five Tribes are also Southerners themselves, and so they came with some of that culture. And so I almost see it as a Western space when there is more opportunity that becomes almost a Southern state. And I think you could almost watch that change happen in other Western territories as you get more white migration.
Hmm.
And like when I talk about the state of Oklahoma and the racial kind of laws that they pass after statehood, I think it's so interesting that I never knew that like possibly kind of one drop rule legislation um, is in Oklahoma, like before it is in many parts of the South.
Right.
And so, like, kind of what does that mean for our ideas of what the West is and kind of who is occupying these Western spaces? And, often it's white Southerners. And so, of course, they're going to bring those ideas with them and kind of change the ideas of a place, even if they're not necessarily changing the demographics yet.
And I think that's an interesting point because yeah, you raise two really interesting questions in the book there towards the end that I wanted to kind of tackle a little bit with you. But um, this there are some individuals out there who, in their ivory tower, look at the South and are like, "Well, that's the place where the race problem comes from, and that's all racist down there." And you kind
Mhm.
of raise this question and say, "Well, is Oklahoma sort of mimicking this kind of racial development in the South, or is actually Oklahoma kind of uh, in part helping it along, leading the way, right?"
And I don't. I mean, I pose the questions because I don't want to answer it in the book. What is the answer? I mean, I guess it can be both, but also it's kind of a question of almost why do we feel the need to keep these very solid ideas of geography and what geography supposedly means. I mean,
Right.
anyone who knows like American history and American current politics knows racism is obviously everywhere in this country, and it's never been confined to just one place. So acknowledging that non-white peoples can have racist ideas, can kind of
Mhm.
um, take those on and make them part of their own culture in different ways, I think allows us to see a place like Indian Territory in Oklahoma as a place that has very similar, sometimes identical views and laws to other places that we identify as racist.
Right. And I guess sort of also the irony is that you have in Indian Territory a space where African Americans had a lot of benefits under native sovereignty, and then that erodes away. How quickly, on some level, you can have the erosion of rights, right?
Right. And as white American settlers move in, I think kind of the facets of these tribes that have always had discriminatory views
Mhm.
kind of see chances to move on that, and to stoke fear among their fellow tribal citizens, which in a way kind of leads to the issues that we have today in Indian country with the descendants of these former slaves, where they don't acknowledge them as tribal citizens. They try to ignore their own treaties in order to kind of reject these people, these descendants.
As we were talking, one of the things that came to mind, obviously, with Oklahoma statehood or territorial status, and then statehood, and sort of the erosion of um, tribal sovereignty, um, which makes some of this possible. I wondered how is this potentially going to change in light of that recent Supreme Court decision where they kind of said that actually tribal land and tribal sovereignty is actually still very much alive. And we kind of messed up there.
Yes, they didn't do what they could have done back then. So, I mean, it was great to see an affirmation of that. Right now, it's kind of working its way through how it's going to be applicable through criminal justice. I would love to see tribes tax like the oil and the gas that is in the region. All of those companies would hate that, obviously.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it's a reminder that things that happened in the 19th century are still very much relevant today, and
Mm-hmm.
also a reminder that those treaties are very important. And if tribes want the American government to abide by those treaties, then they themselves need to abide by those treaties and the promises they made to their former slaves.
Right. I was just going to ask, so if that would also change, obviously, the dynamics that African Americans face in Oklahoma today. Is that there's treaty stipulations that now would have to be lived up to, right?
You would think so.
Well, I hope so.
Yes, I mean, I think it sets an undeniable legal precedent, but the unfortunate truth is that most of these tribes, other than the Cherokees right now, who are doing great, are going to have to be forced through the court system.
uh, it sounds like there's another book in the makings then eventually on how native sovereignty and statehood interact together in the Supreme Court making decisions.
I'm definitely going into the slightly more modern day with book two.
I was going to ask, what are your future plans there with the next project, if you are willing to share?
I'll share just a little bit. It will look at Supreme Court decisions. It will look at more recent kind of interactions between freedmen descendants and these tribes, and also the narratives that these tribes tell about themselves, which usually exclude Black people who were part of their nations for over 100 years.
Wow, that does sound interesting. So, just out of curiosity, then, uh, how is your relationship with the tribes in Oklahoma? Are you thinking like, I mean, obviously right now that's not going to be possible, but in the future, you thinking kind of going to the tribes, kind of doing book talks, kind of highlighting this history to them, or are you um, try to I guess what's the word choice here? Trying to engage them in other ways.
Honestly, after this book is published officially, I'm kind of worried I'm going to be public enemy number one, and my like face is going to be up on an office somewhere, and I can't be let into any of the tribal buildings.
Uh-oh.
Um, but I have made contact, like through my graduate career, really, with various Chickasaws and Choctaws who understand that the narrative needs to change, that not allowing people like myself to be tribal citizens, as these treaties promise, is wrong, and want to kind of engage and open a dialogue. But there are still lots and lots of people who are not. And tribal governments believe they have a lot to lose, money wise, resource wise, if they kind of acknowledge this history. So it's a constantly evolving issue.
Which is sort of ironic living in Georgia. There's so many white individuals here who are like, oh, I have Cherokee ancestry and are so proud of it. And then you have like somebody who actually has family in the native lands who can't get tribal kind of relations and citizenship. It seems so it, just strange that you have individuals whose ancestors helped remove the Cherokee are like proud that, oh, I have Cherokee blood in me, and then people that are Cherokees that can't get that recognition.
Yes, native identity is a fun or a complex things to study because it is something people want to claim.
Hmm.
Um, and so it leads to native nations becoming very kind of territorial.
Right.
And I understand that, but often the way they gauge identity has elements of anti blackness and elements of prejudice against certain people.
Yeah. And that's probably the big point to take away from today is that racism comes in many different forms, as you said, and anyone is potentially susceptible and to be racist.
And that we need to understand how non-white people think about race and deploy racism toward their own goals. I mean, it's not just every kind of non-white group's relation to whiteness. Like there are other stories to tell
Yeah,
about racism and race and settler colonialism.
yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you for taking the time and to talk with me about this. Um, I think it's a really fascinating book. I'm glad you published it, and uh, I think it's out, right? I should ask.
Out April 5th officially, but
Gosh.
you can buy it now. Buy it whenever.
All right, so we will publish the first set of interview videos just as your book comes out.
Okay.